From the very beginning, the God of War franchise has been known for delivering some of the best boss fights you'll ever experience in video games. From thrilling set pieces of epic scale to grueling fights that put all of your skills to the ultimate test. God of War Ragnarok is coming soon, and the hope is that it will continue that tradition. And based on what we've seen of it so far, it certainly seems like things are shaping up that way. Before we dive into its offerings, however, here we're going to take a look back at all of the major boss fights across all God of War installments and rank them from worst to best. Although there aren't really any bad God of War boss fights, so it might be more accurate to say that we're ranking them from decent to spectacular. 40. SCYLLA, God of War Ghost of Sparta. God of War Ghost of Sparta's opening boss fight is very reminiscent of the likes of the Basilisk and the Hydra, in that it's an intro boss fight that sees Kratos taking on a sea monster. But frankly, it's not as good as any of them. It's very short and doesn't test the player at all, and the fact that the first encounter and the conclusion are separated by a decent chunk of gameplay doesn't exactly help with the formidableness of the creature. Then again, the final QTE sequence does result in a pretty gory death for the SCYLLA, which is always fun to see. 39. Helios, God of War 3. Kratos' encounter against Helios isn't much of a boss fight, so it makes sense to put it at the tail end of the list. The fight is quite brief and not very challenging. Essentially, it's a cutscene with some gameplay elements that mostly take the form of QuickTime events. Still, it's an incredible encapsulation of God of War 3's gleefully excessive gore and violence, what with Kratos literally ripping Helios' head off with his bare hands. 38. The Persian King, God of War Chains of Olympus. The idea of taking on a brute of a Persian warrior while playing as a brute of a Spartan warrior is an inherently intriguing one, but Chains of Olympus' Persian King doesn't make much of an impression. That's not to say that the fight itself isn't fun. The QTE sequence that closes it off is typically slick, if nothing else, but it's a rather straightforward fight that doesn't really challenge you in any interesting or unique ways. 37. Theseus, God of War 2. God of War 2 is chock full of thrilling boss encounters, but of that group, Theseus is probably the one that stands out the least. Given how solid the game's combat mechanics are at their core, Theseus is a fun opponent to take on in battle, especially because he does have some tricky moves up his arsenal that you need to watch out for. But at the end of the day, it's a fight that feels like something that exists primarily to spice up the game's pacing rather than to test the player's skills. 36. Deimos, God of War Ghost of Sparta. Kratos' fight against Deimos is almost disappointingly small scale. You'd expect the clash of the two brothers to be way more high-octane and intense, especially given everything that's happened in the game up to that point. But the Kratos vs Deimos duel just ends up serving as a very brief prelude to the real trademark boss fight of Ghost of Sparta, which we'll get to later. Again, it's still a fun fight, but it doesn't have the flair that you'd want it to. 35. Hermes, God of War 3. More of a chase than a boss fight, the Hermes encounter in God of War 3 gets bonus points for its unique hook, and the solid execution of that hook. Chasing the Olympian speedster through a thrilling set piece leads into a mano-a-mano brawl, which of course culminates in Kratos brutalizing Hermes, killing him and chopping off his legs so that he can use his boots. God of War 3's wonderfully excessive gore shines through once again here, and it's amazing. 34. Perseus, God of War 2. Similar to Theseus, Perseus is a boss fight that doesn't demand too much skill, and it's not terribly important to the game's larger story either. But while it doesn't stay long in the memory on those fronts, it does see you taking on an enemy that's invisible for a huge chunk of the encounter. Watching for his movements through splashes of water while avoiding his attacks and dishing out your own is a fun twist that does bring some uniqueness to the table. 33. The Basilisk, God of War Chains of Olympus. You expect God of War games to kick things off with epic boss fights. And that's very much an expectation that people had of Chains of Olympus as well, in spite the fact that it was a PSP game. Thankfully, it lived up to those expectations. Kratos squares off against the massive Basilisk in the opening minutes of the handheld title, and though it's not a fight that does anything special, it hits all the notes that you'd want a God of War boss fight to. 32. Clotho, God of War 2. Taking on the Sisters of Fate is one of the most significant things Kratos does in God of War 2, but not all three sisters are equally fun to fight, or even equally challenging. The big giant Clotho, the third and final sister who stands in Kratos' way, might be much larger in size than her sisters, but frankly, taking her down is almost a cakewalk. It's more of an obstacle course littered with mini puzzles than an actual fight. It gets points for its experimental structure and for wanting to mix things up, but as a boss fight, it's not as good as what precedes it, or what follows it. 31. Scorpius, God of War 3. The Scorpius boss fight in God of War 3 has almost no narrative significance, so there's a good chance that many might not even remember it, but purely from a mechanical perspective, it's a heck of a fight. From requiring players to use multiple weapons to its hyper-violent QTE sequence to the way it concludes, it's an enjoyable encounter from beginning to end, and one that actually demands some level of skill from players. 30. Euryale, God of War 2. Similar to God of War 3's Scorpius, God of War 2's Euryale might not have any narrative significance, but from a gameplay perspective, it's hard not to enjoy this encounter. By this point, Kratos has fought plenty of similar creatures, from Gorgons to Medusa herself, but the Euryale puts an interesting twist on that enemy design, from her elemental attacks to her unique and varied moveset, which includes coiling around pillars around the battle arena and climbing up them. 29. Trolls, God of War 2018. God of War 2018's Trolls aren't really boss fights for the most part. Some are mini-bosses, and a couple are even optional. And honestly, there isn't an awful lot of variation among all the different types of trolls you face. It makes sense to bundle them together in a single entry then. Thanks to the game's solid combat mechanics, the trolls are always fun to fight, but they do get repetitive after a point, which is something the game has often been criticized for. 28. Alecto and Tisiphone, God of War Ascension. God of War Ascension might be the black sheep of the God War family, but it does have a few redeeming qualities. The boss fights, for instance, are solid more often than not, largely thanks to the fact that the game very much follows in God of War 3's footsteps in terms of going for scale. The final fight against Alecto and Tisiphone doesn't have the narrative impact that you'd want from a final boss in a God of War game, but then again, that's true for pretty much all of Ascension. On the other hand, this is also a fight with immense scale and formulaic yet enjoyable QTE sequences, and as rote as it is, it's still a fun encounter. 27. POLLUX and CASTOR, God of War Ascension. The POLLUX and CASTOR boss fight deserves credit for trying to inject some intriguing new wrinkles into the proceedings, because here you're taking on a foe that can slow down time, which allows him to manipulate the battlefield in interesting ways, from area of effect attacks to jumping up on top of pillars that you then have to break down. Meanwhile, every time you hit the boss, he gets older, which is just an incredibly cool detail. 26. Hydra, God of War. The very first boss fight of the God of War franchise might seem almost quaint in retrospect, when you compare it to everything that's happened in the series since then, but it still holds a special place in the hearts of series fans. It was an almost perfect introduction to God of War, from its scale and brutal QTEs to how immaculately it was paced across multiple stages. Call it nostalgia, call it timeless design. Either way, the Hydra boss fight has aged very, very well. 25. Charon, God of War Chains of Olympus. God of War Chains of Olympus doesn't have too many boss fights. It's not a very long game after all, but a couple of them do stand out nonetheless. Charon is definitely one that falls in that group. Taking on the ferryman of the dead on a boat floating amidst a grim and bloody environment is an exciting idea, and from the visuals to the way the fight itself is set up, the game pulls it off successfully in a number of ways. Charon can also be a surprisingly tricky foe to take down, especially on higher difficulties, so he gets bonus points for that. 24. Barbarian King, God of War 2. If not for the Barbarian King, the God of War franchise's story wouldn't exist. Given how crucial he was, ever so briefly, at a major turning point in Kratos' life, it was incredibly cool to see him come back from the dead in God of War 2 and challenge Kratos to round 2. Even from a gameplay perspective, this is a hell of a fight, whether that's because of his massive size, his varied moveset, or the fact that he comes charging at you with an undead horse. 23. Pandora's Guardian, God of War. Boss fights are always fun when they mix incredible enemy design with specific patterns, and the encounter against the massive armored Minotaur in Pandora's Temple does that almost perfectly. The pattern of weakening the monstrosity, then using the ballistas to him, and then interspersing that with trademark God of War QTEs is impeccably paced, and uses unique mechanics to great effect. The Minotaur boss fight also features excellent music, which doesn't hurt either. 22. Dragon, God of War 2018. This boss fight brings some Dark Souls to God of War, and we loved it. Kratos and Atreus make it out of the mountain's innards, narrowly escaping an attack from a massive dragon, but soon cross paths with it again, at which point it's time for Kratos to do what he does best. It's a solid fight, if not a particularly challenging one, especially compared to some of the others in the game, combining mechanics and spectacle perfectly. Of course, it ends in typically brutal fashion, with Kratos stabbing the dragon through its mouth with a massive claw mechanism. 21. Megara and Tisiphone, God of War Ascension. Here's yet another mechanically solid God of War Ascension boss fight that's let down by the narrative context surrounding it. Taking on Megara and Tisiphone together at the same time keeps you constantly on your toes, and the two often combine their attacks to come at Kratos in really cool ways. It's appropriately challenging, it feels different from the other boss fights in the game, and it's enjoyable on a fundamental level. The fact that your foes turn out to be mere illusions sure is a little disappointing though. 20. Magni and Modi, God of War 2018. Yet another example of a tag team boss fight. God of War sure loves those, doesn't it? The sons of Thor cross paths with Kratos and Atreus a couple of times throughout their journey to Jotunheim, and the set-piece battle against the two of them together is certainly one of the game's highlights. Coming at you with different weapons and fighting styles that they also routinely use in conjunction to great effect, dealing with both Magni and Modi together is a thrillingly tricky affair. The battle also throws in sequences where Kratos and Atreus are surrounded by darkness with their backs to each other, while trying to figure out where the next attack is going to come from and dodge it, which is also pulled off spectacularly. 19. Kraken, God of War 2. The Kraken boss fight is a memorable one for multiple reasons. On top of that, the fight itself is an absolute blast. You're staring this creature dead in the eye, chopping off its tentacles one after the other, and it all concludes with you literally stabbing it through the mouth with a giant bridge. It's not hard to be impressed with that. 18. Erinis, God of War Ghost of Sparta. The Erinis boss fight ranks as one of the best in all of Ghosts of Sparta. Divided into two very distinct stages, it goes from an intense fight between Kratos and Erinis in her relatively normal form, before then turning into a literal flight through the skies, where you're going after her monstrous flying creature form. It combines top-notch mechanics and enemy design with incredible set-piece design. 17. Zeus, God of War 2. Kratos fights Zeus several times throughout God of War 2 and 3, and their face-off at the end of the former, after Kratos successfully manages to travel back in time and stop Zeus from killing him, is one that sticks in the memory. The fight is appropriately long and goes through multiple stages, combining challenging sequences with thrilling QTE chains, all of which is, of course, wrapped up in a thrilling finale to an incredible game. 16. Persephone, God of War Chains of Olympus. God of War Chains of Olympus ends with a bang. In fact, it may very well have among the best endings in the entire series. Taking on Persephone and Atlas upon reaching Elysium is the perfect mixture of scale, stakes, and challenge, and caps the brief but memorable game perfectly. It's also an extremely personal encounter for Kratos, who is finally reunited with his dead daughter before being quickly and heart-wrenchingly torn away from her almost immediately afterward. 15. Hecatoncheires, God of War Ascension. The opening boss fight against the Hecatoncheires is by far the best fight in all of God of War Ascension. No part of the game shines as brightly as its opening does. You expect incredible scale from God of War bosses, especially those who are central in the opening act, and boy does the Hecatoncheires deliver. It almost sets the expectations too high for the game's own good, because nothing that follows comes even close to its level. 14. The Dark Elf King, God of War 2018. In terms of scale, the Dark Elf King boss fight would be ranked very low on the list, but in terms of pure mechanics, this is one of the series' best encounters. The game demands you to pay attention to your enemy's attacks and movement patterns and adapt in the moment, and challenges you to fully utilize your arsenal of attacks and abilities. Like the Magni and Modi fight, it also uses darkness very well. It's a proper test of the player's skills. 13. Baldur, God of War 2018. God of War 2018 begins on a high note and ends on a high note, and in both sequences, high-octane fights against Baldur are the focal point, though we'll get to the first encounter in a bit. The final fight of the game is a suitably thrilling one, taking Kratos, Atreus, and Baldur across realms on the back of a dragon, falling through the sky, and then battling it out on the ground. Oh, and there's a reanimated corpse of a giant in the background to deal with. Throughout this sequence, God of War 2018 channels the epic scale of its predecessor more than it does anywhere else. 12. Hades, God of War 3. When Kratos clashes swords with Hades in God of War 3, he faces appropriately stiff challenge. The one-on-one duel lacks the over-the-top scope of some other boss fights in the game, but it's a very well-designed encounter that combines spectacle, enemy design, narrative stakes, and mechanics in an almost perfect blend. The fact that you get to use Hades' signature weapon after killing him is also a bonus. 11. Hercules, God of War 3. This is essentially Kratos versus the Incredible Hulk. God of War 3's multi-stage Hercules boss battle is one of the game's best moments. You go from weakening him bit by bit and taking off pieces of his armor, to taking his massive gauntlets off of him and then pummeling him to death with them. It's excellently paced and built around extremely satisfying combat mechanics and patterns. In true God of War 3 fashion, it's also an incredible brutal fight, which makes it that much more memorable. 10. Valkyries, God of War 2018. Like we did with the Trolls, we're bundling all but one of the Valkyries together, though of course these boss fights are a lot more varied than the Troll encounters, and also a hell of a lot more challenging. Almost notoriously so, in fact. The Valkyries, in spite of being completely optional foes, are regarded as some of the best boss fights in God of War 2018, which should tell you just how good they are. They're an excellent endgame challenge for players who want to push their skills to the limit. 9. Thanatos, God of War Ghost of Sparta. Kratos and Deimos' duel in Ghost of Sparta is a bit of an anticlimactic one, as we mentioned earlier, but what it leads into is anything but. The brothers join forces and take on Thanatos, who is an appropriately formidable opponent. Not only was it a slick and exciting encounter that capped off the story spectacularly, it also centered around the unique hook of Kratos and Deimos working together to kill their enemy. When it comes to the handheld God of War games, this is easily the best boss fight. 8. The Colossus of Rhodes, God of War 2. The Colossus of Rhodes is almost the quintessential God of War opening boss fight. It's a multi-staged encounter against a foe that outsizes you to an almost ridiculous degree, and it takes several forms throughout that opening sequence. From fighting against its hands to using environmental elements against it, from taking it on head-on to literally going inside of it and pummeling its mechanical heart, the Colossus is a prime example of how to kick off a God of War game, though not the only one. More on that in a bit. 7. Ares, God of War. A game as incredible as the original God of War needed a memorable final boss to close things off properly, and sure enough, it delivered on that front. Taking on Ares works just as well on a gameplay level as it does on a story level. Whether you're trapped in Kratos' own mind while Ares tortures him with his tragic past, or ballooning in size and killing Ares by using a sword you borrowed from a statue, this boss fight was the perfect way to bring the game to a close. 6. The Stranger, God of War 2018. God of War 2018 changed many things for the franchise, but it didn't change the tradition of kicking things off with a jaw-dropping boss encounter. Unless you count that first troll as the game's first boss. Let's not do that. Known at the time as the Stranger, when Baldur shows up at Kratos' and Atreus' house, things quickly take a turn for the worst, and the brutal brawl against him escalates very quickly, in typically epic fashion. The fact that this boss fight makes more of an impact even than the final showdown against Baldur should tell you something about how good it is. 5. Atropos and Lachesis, God of War 2. Zeus is Kratos' final foe in God of War 2, but his fight against Atropos and Lachesis is probably the game's best boss encounter. The two Sisters of Fate challenge the Ghost of Sparta as a tag team, and boy do they put up a good fight. The multi-staged encounter throws a number of challenges at Kratos, combining fast-moving enemies with threatening attacks with a healthy mix of patterns, aerial combat and more, while one sequence in particular also takes Kratos back to the moment of his final fight against Ares, which is an incredibly cool story sequence, if nothing else. All in all, it's a thrilling rollercoaster of a boss fight that probably ranks as the best that God of War 2 has to offer. 4. Poseidon, God of War 3. We've spoken about a number of excellent opening God of War sequences, but none of those can hope to match the sheer jaw-dropping spectacle of Kratos' fight against Poseidon in the opening minutes of God of War 3. Poseidon proves to be a formidable enemy to Kratos, but what makes this fight really stand out is its unbelievable scale, with Kratos and Poseidon fighting on top of a constantly moving and shifting battlefield, Gaia herself as she climbs up Mount Olympus while the Titans and the Olympians wage their epic battle in the background. 3. Zeus, God of War 3. God of War 3 is the epitome of grand boss fights, so it makes sense that the game closes things off with another one of those. Kratos' final duel against his murderous, genocidal father takes many forms across its many stages. Side-scrolling brawler, one-on-one duel, a fight inside Gaia, and large-scale clashes of ethereal powers. All of it is wrapped up into a single epic closer that encapsulates the best tendencies of that era of the franchise in every way possible. Brutality? Check. Scale? Check. Stakes? Check. And that's just scratching the surface. 2. Sigrun, God of War 2018. You knew this was coming. Obviously, Sigrun was going to rank very high in this list, in spite of the fact that she's an entirely optional and missable boss. If you're looking for something challenging, this is the best you're going to get in God of War 2018. Banging your head against a wall time and time again might not be something that appeals to everyone, which is fair enough, but you can't help but appreciate the mechanical perfection of this fight, and just how incredibly satisfying it is to finally master it and beat it. 1. Kronos, God of War 3. An obvious choice. But it's obvious for a reason. When you have a set-piece boss fight such as this one, which is perfect in almost every way and stands as one of the best sequences in the entire history, if not the very best, it doesn't make sense to not give it credit, simply for the sake of trying to avoid the obvious pick. We've mentioned the word scale quite a few times throughout this feature, but every large-scale God of War boss fight falls completely flat compared to what the Kronos set-piece does. It's an astounding achievement that still boggles the mind, more than a decade on from God of War 3's original launch. If God of War Ragnarok manages to deliver a boss fight that can legitimately challenge Kronos for this crown, that'll be nothing short of a miracle. And that's not a slight on Ragnarok in the slightest. That's just how good the Kronos fight is. So what are your thoughts on this? Go ahead and share them in the comments below. And if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon to get new video updates. We upload every day and would really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.